Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I was sitting with the CEO of one of America's biggest and most influential companies last month, and I asked him a simple question. What could President Trump do that would be a bridge too far for you? What attack on democracy or the rule of law could Trump make that would cause you to speak up?
Hey everyone, and welcome to Liberty. Watch where we dive deep into everything American, from politics and policy to culture and the Constitution. Here, we put the values, voices, and interests of the American people first. No spin, no nonsense, just real talk about what matters most to our country. Subscribe and join us as we stand up for liberty, truth, and the American way.
His answer was pretty simple and it was pretty confident. He said that if Trump were to ignore a Supreme Court ruling, that would cross the line. He was reflecting a familiar theme, that until President Trump thumbs his nose definitively at a court ruling, then his attacks on democracy are troubling but not lethal. It's normal politics up until that dramatic confrontation between the executive branch and the judicial branch, for which the Constitution, as we know, really has no prescribed remedy. And for many Americans, they may breathe a sigh of relief that America's, most influential private sector leaders would rise up to defend democracy if this confrontation that we worry about came to pass. Combined with a massive public mobilization, we could be saved. But I didn't breathe a sigh of relief. The opposite. I'm deeply worried that we have really spent little time studying the paths that democracies take when they collapse. Most of the time, there is not a singular moment when the executive dramatically seizes power. There's not normally a brazen attempt to burn down the Parliament building. No, instead, democracies die when gradually, often quietly and methodically over time, the structures that hold the executive accountable for corruption, for thievery, for wrongdoing are dismantled. Dismantled so that citizens can no longer hold the executive accountable. Dismantled so that the political opposition never has enough room to maneuver meaningfully.
When we think about the potential collapse of democracy, we often envision a dramatic, high-stakes event, a military coup overthrowing a government, a dictator openly seizing control of all power, or a leader blatantly flouting the law in a way that signals the end of democratic rule. This kind of sudden, catastrophic event, one that would shake the very foundations of our society, seems like the obvious tipping point. But what if the true threat to democracy isn't sudden at all? What if the danger isn't the dramatic moment we all anticipate, but the quiet, gradual dismantling of the very structures that have protected our democracy for centuries? Democracy is often depicted as a fragile concept, but in truth, its erosion is not usually marked by an immediate collapse. The death of democracy tends to be slow, insidious, and often unnoticed until it's too late. It doesn't happen all at once, with one grand, unmistakable act of tyranny. Instead, it unfolds through a series of small, seemingly isolated actions that chip away at the integrity of key institutions. Over time, these institutions designed to serve as the bedrock of accountability, transparency, and checks on power become weakened, manipulated, or eliminated. This is the real risk we face today.
Because our democracy isn't at risk of dying, it is dying. As we speak, we are watching it die. It is not too late to save it. Let me say that again. It is not too late to save our democracy, but we can't continue to close our eyes and think that our democracy can survive a coordinated assault on those four key institutions of accountability. Democrats and Republicans need to see what is happening before our eyes, rise up and defend the independence of journalists, of lawyers, of universities, and of the private sector. So I want to spend a minute or two to walk you through what President Trump is doing and how it frankly, chillingly mirrors the tactics that other leaders have used to transition real democracy into pretend fake democracy. It always starts with journalists. From Hungary to Belarus to Venezuela, countries that have elections, but elections where one party just keeps on winning. These are places where journalists are subject to nonstop harassment campaign from the regime, such that people just stop doing journalism or journalists stop telling the full truth. Last month, for instance, the Turkish president, Erdogan, locked up 11 journalists simply because they were covering protests against Erdogan's jailing of the top opposition leaders. Now, Trump has not started jailing journalists, but the pace of harassment in the first 60 days of his second term is alarming. He's denied access to government buildings, including the White House, to journalists who don't use pre-approved language from the White House. He is preferencing credentials to partisan journalists who simply parrot his party line. His FCC has begun to deliberately harass media companies that are owned by political opponents of the president. But Trump's campaign to destroy independent journalism, it has a darker and more menacing side, because Trump isn't just trying to intimidate journalists so that they'll be afraid to tell the truth. He's also trying to destroy the concept of truth itself. And again, this is a key facet of leaders who are elected who are trying to transition democracies away and into something very different. How do you destroy truth? Well, that's why the Secretary of Defense looks into the camera and tells the American public that the text messages that everybody read, filled with classified information and war plans, did not include classified information and war plans. The White House wants you to believe that 1 + 1 does not equal 2 any longer, that you should doubt even the clear things that you see with our eyes, that nothing is real, that nothing is true. That if you are a supporter of the regime and I tell you 1 + 1 = 3, then 1 + 1 = 3. Those weren't war plans, those weren't classified documents. That's also why the official position of the White House on key issues like tariffs changes every hour. Because if the ground truth just changes constantly, then there's no truth at all. Journalists are made to look foolish by reporting a true thing at 9 a.m. that becomes untrue at 10 a.m. Journalism loses its credibility when the facts being distributed by the White House change all the time. Trump says the tariffs are permanent. Journalists report the president says the tariffs are permanent. An hour later, Trump says, I never said they're permanent. They're not permanent. I'm cutting deals. They write that he's cutting deals. An hour later, they're suspended. No more tariffs. When the truth changes constantly, it's hard to believe that there's anything true any longer. Second, universities are always a target of would-be autocrats. Again, in Turkey, the government has terminated thousands of professors just because they criticize the government.
Democracy dies not through one single catastrophic event, but through a series of gradual steps that go unnoticed until the damage is irreparable. The institutions that serve as the backbone of democracy, the press, the judiciary, the legal profession, universities, and the private sector are under relentless attack. When these institutions are no longer independent, when they no longer serve as the watchdogs of government or protect dissenting voices, the very idea of democracy is hollowed out. In the speech, the speaker recounts a conversation with a high-profile CEO of one of America's largest and most influential companies. The CEO was asked a simple but important question: what would it take for you to speak up against President Trump? What would he need to do that would push you to stand against him? At first glance, this answer may seem comforting. It suggests that if the president were to act against the courts, the business community, the powerful private sector would rise and fight back to defend democracy. But here's the problem. It's not just about one dramatic moment of defiance. Democracy is dying in the quiet, incremental actions that erode the structures of accountability, long before any confrontation with the courts happens. The fear here is that Americans, and especially the powerful elites who hold significant influence, are overlooking the true danger, the systematic dismantling of the institutions that protect democracy. The speaker argues that democracy doesn't need to be destroyed in one dramatic act. Instead, it can erode through a series of calculated, often quiet assaults on key pillars that ensure a functioning democratic society. The institutions that need to be protected include the press, the legal profession, universities, and the private sector. These institutions don't just represent power in different forms, they represent accountability, truth, and free expression. The actions that might seem minor at first, but when viewed as part of a larger pattern, reveal a clear agenda to destroy the very systems that hold power accountable.
But having watched what Trump has done one by one to universities and law firms, why would we assume the tariffs aren't just simply a tool to do the same thing to big companies? So what I'm trying to say here is that you don't need a battle royale between the president and the Supreme Court for democracy to die. If journalists are constantly looking over their shoulder and unable to report on the truth, if protest is suppressed, even moderately at universities, if lawyers start giving cover instead of uncovering corruption and illegality in the regime, if companies start being mouthpieces for the regime as a price of doing business, if all that happens, then we are not a real democracy anymore. We are a fake democracy. Elections still happen, like in Turkey, like in Hungary, like in Venezuela, but the rules are going to be tilted. And dissent will be suppressed so much that the same side, Trump's side, wins over and over and over. And this should matter not just to Democrats, not just to members of the minority party. This should matter to Republicans as well. We swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. And it is time for us to see the game that is being played. The good news is that the rules have not been fully rigged yet. There is still time, not loads of it, but there is still time for this body to set a tone that causes the kind of massive public outrage necessary to stop this campaign of destruction in its tracks. But that requires those of us who believe that the threat to democracy is urgent to act like it. That means saying to our Republican colleagues that we're not going to act like business as usual, that we're not going to proceed to legislation unless we have agreement, Republicans and Democrats, to stop this assault on free speech and dissent. It requires the minority party to say that right now. Only if we come together are we going to have a chance to save ourselves from the fate that has befallen so many other countries that have slowly, too quietly, seen their countries transition from real democracy to fake democracy.
The speaker urges that democracy can survive without an outright catastrophic event, like an executive defying the Supreme Court. Instead, it can die when key institutions like the press, the courts, universities, and businesses are slowly strangled, leaving the public unable to distinguish truth from lies, justice from corruption, or dissent from submission. Democracy doesn't have to die in a single explosive moment. It can die quietly over time, as the institutions that hold power accountable are dismantled and destroyed. The press, the legal system, universities, and businesses must not be allowed to fall under the control of a single political agenda. If they do, the elections we hold, the votes we cast, and the laws we pass will all be meaningless. But there is still time. It's not too late to save democracy if we act now. But that action requires all of us, regardless of party affiliation, to recognize the assault on democracy for what it is and rise to defend the institutions that safeguard our freedom and our future.